This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the Red Leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 188, Tattoos. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the details that you may have come across in the various Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you inked up and ready to go?
I've got ink all over my fingers, but wait, it's based on my last fountain pen repair.
That is one of the things about using fountain pens is you begin to get stained whether you like it or not. It's a mark of the work, I guess. Well, We're going to talk about the mark of the work of tattoo artists here on this episode. Before we do, just wanted to remind you that this episode is available at ihose.co/trifles188. That is the site that will take you to our show notes on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. You can leave us a comment there on that show notes page, or you can email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, and you can find us on your favorite social networks. We are I Hear of Sherlock in every one of those places. We have, as I said, 187 episodes under our belt here. We are rounding the corner toward 200. That'll be something. If you have recommendations for topics that you would like us to cover in these stories, is there something that you read in a Sherlock Holmes story? Is there a term you came across? Is there a conundrum that you may be wondering about? We would be glad to take it up here on Trifles, so just let us know. We'd be happy to do that. So, on with the show. Tattoos. You know, tattoos seem like a modern kind of thing. I mean, I think tattoos are certainly more common today than we have seen in the past. It seems to be kind of a cultural thing. But we know that tattoos have been around for a while. You know, my own father has a tattoo that he got when he was in the military, and it seems to be connected with the military in a number of ways, and particularly with maritime life. So why don't we delve a little bit, Burt, into where we come across tattoos in the Sherlock Holmes stories and why tattoos would even be important to Sherlock Holmes.
That's a great question. They are important to Sherlock Holmes because it is one of the indicators that can allow a lot of inference about where a person comes from or how they've been living their life. And in fact, that's the first time we see evidence of a tattoo in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. In the very first report by Watson in A Study in Scarlet, there's a lovely scene, and it's early on, where Watson is still trying to understand and dope out what this Sherlock Holmes fellow can do. In which Holmes and Watson very early in the case, in fact, it's right at the start of chapter 3, the Lauriston Gardens mystery, when they're established in Baker Street, and Watson observes to the reader, you know, I was really continually startled by Sherlock Holmes. My respect for his powers of analysis increased wondrously, but I was still had some suspicion. Maybe some of these things were prearranged to dazzle me. And at this point, Holmes has looked out the window and made a series of conclusions about someone on the street who then appeared in the rooms in Baker Street, and turned out that Holmes was exactly correct. And that was just astonishing. And that's why Watson at the start of chapter 3 says, well, how did you deduce that? And Holmes can barely remember his past comment. Deduce what? And that's one of the early appearances of our favorite word here, trifles, because Watson says, well, how did you know he was a retired sergeant of the Marines? Oh, I have no time for trifles. Oh, look, excuse my rudeness. Okay. So, perhaps it's just as well we talk about it. Well, it's easier to explain than why I know it. And it turns out that among the things that Holmes deduced from this fellow's gait and so on, he was able to spy a tattoo.
That is, that is one of the reasons we love Sherlock Holmes, his ability to observe the things that other people don't. And, it's interesting. So many of these things come from just a glance. It wasn't as if, it was something that was held out for all to see. Holmes picked it up just in a millisecond, maybe a nanosecond. But his brain works in such a way that he's able to piece these things together and draw conclusions very quickly, which, when you stop to explain it to someone, it takes a while to process that. But for him, it was happening in a minute, and just boom, it was there. So
the interesting thing, though, too, is that when we as contemporary readers look, first of all, it's a wonderful scene and it's beautifully written. But if you just look at it in the cold light of common sense, Holmes says, even across the street, I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand. That smacked of the sea. Well, okay, sure it did. But how do we get to a sergeant of the Marines rather than a Navy ensign or some other official in the Royal Navy? Military carriage, okay. Regulations, side whiskers, well, I guess so. Certain amount of importance. And then he sort of lands based on the fellow's age and other things that perhaps he was a sergeant. But I don't know. To me, it seems he could just as easily have been an ensign. But who am I?
Well, it's interesting too that we see so much of reference to tattoos, or really all of the reference to tattoos in the Sherlock Holmes stories have something to do with seafaring culture. And this could be because tattoos are more prevalent or more widely practiced or used in societies around the world that are reachable by sea. And therefore it would have been part of the, the tourist guide to East Asia, as it were. You travel around the world and you pick up some of their habits or some of their customs, and you come back. I mean, it's reminiscent of Queequeg in Moby Dick. Now, you remember the first character that our narrator Ishmael met was Queequeg, and he was described in chapter 3 of Moby Dick. It described Queequeg's face as of a dark purplish yellow color, here and there stuck over with large blackish looking squares. And later on he realizes that they're tattoos, and he said there was no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, nothing but a scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bald purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. And then later on, after Queequeg disrobed, Ishmael described his body as, he said, at last showed his chest and arms. As I live, these covered parts of him were checkered with the same squares. He seemed to have been in a 30 years war and just escaped from it with a sticking plaster shirt. Still more, his legs were marked as if a parcel of dark green frogs were running up the trunks of young palms. And of course, we recall that Queequeg was taking great effort into carving those same tattoos into the lid of his coffin. So that was really, it became part of him and his identity. And I think when people choose to tattoo themselves, that's what they're doing. And certainly it's art, but it's also part of how they self-identify. Or I guess as George Carlin used to call it, self-mutilation as an attention getter.
Well, you're right. I mean, it is. I think today it's very much, I have some friends who have tattoos, and some of them signify, as they do for people in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, great affection that one person will have for another, but also some signify hobbies or great personal interests. Although I must say I have never had any inclination at all to get designs implanted into my skin. But I wonder how the cultural attitude obviously the cultural attitude has changed since the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th. I wonder when tattooing started. Well, clearly it probably started with ancient peoples and so on. But
it has.
And it's great that you quote, Melville, because Moby Dick's one of my favorite books. And of course, before he wrote Moby Dick, Melville had an extensive sea voyage, which he then recounted in a novel, which was enormously successful. And so he clearly did go to all of these places and see these things. But I wonder in Holmes's London if there were tattoo parlors down by the docks.
Interesting you should say that, because that is exactly what we're going to talk about when we come back right after this quick word. With each passing season brings another passing quarterly issue of the Baker Street Journal. This scholarly journal has been around since 1946, and each year produces 4 volumes, one for each season: spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and a bonus Christmas annual. That's right, that's 5 issues every year of the Baker Street Journal, which consists of some of the best Sherlockian scholarship around the world. In each issue, you can read authors, people like yourself from all around the world and all around the Sherlockian societies, who write in with their theories on Dr. Watson's bullpup, Sherlock Holmes' proficiency on the violin, the appearance of Mycroft Holmes and Mrs. Hudson, and more. If you can imagine something interesting to write about in the Sherlock Holmes stories, then someone probably will, in the Baker Street Journal. Are you subscribed? Get over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and make sure you are part of the BSJ tradition today. We are back talking about tattoos and how that affected Sherlock Holmes and their impact on the world. And Bert, you had said something about tattoos being a part of ancient culture, and that's absolutely true. They've been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, Smithsonian Magazine has an article about the ancient and mysterious history of tattoos. There's been evidence of tattoos on mummies that have been found, Egyptian mummies and icemen that have been discovered. But if we look at Wikipedia's overview of tattoos, and it is extensive, there is a section after all of these kind of Pacific country summaries where they talk about the reintroduction to the Western world. They say the popularity of modern Western tattooing owes its origins in large part to Captain James Cook's voyages to the South Pacific in the 1770s. But since the 1950s, a false belief has persisted that modern Western tattooing originated exclusively from these voyages. Tattooing has been consistently present in Western society from the modern period stretching back to ancient Greece, though largely for different reasons. a long history of European tattoo predated these voyages, including those among sailors and tradesmen, pilgrims visiting the Holy Land, and on Europeans living among Native Americans. So we like to tell ourselves that it was because of Captain Cook, and certainly that contributed to it, but it was not the lone factor. The first documented professional tattooer in the United States was Martin Hildebrandt, a German immigrant who arrived in Boston in 1846. And between 1861 and 65, he tattooed soldiers on both sides of the American Civil War.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, one wonders what those images, now see if Bob Katz was part of this conversation, he would say, and that's why Watson has this secret tattoo. And he got just after Pickett's charge. He probably tattooed something on his leg to remind himself that he'd been shot there.
Well, it's funny because one of the tattoos that we come across in the canon is in the Gloria Scott, and it looks like it serves as a reminder itself. It was when Holmes freaks out Trevor Sr., he said, well, you certainly touched upon a rather tender point. Might I ask how you know and how much you know? He spoke now in a half-jesting fashion, but a look of terror still lurked in the back of his eyes. And Holmes said, it's simplicity itself. When you bared your arm to draw that fish into the boat, I saw that J.A. had been tattooed in the bend of your elbow. The letters were still legible, but it was perfectly clear from their blurred appearance and from the staining of the skin around them that efforts had been made to obliterate them then. It was obvious then that those initials had once been very familiar to you, and you had afterwards wished to forget them.
Yes, well, this is a couple of lovely things going on here. One is this is one of the early cases of Sherlock Holmes, so he is recounting this memory from before he met Watson. And this is a great case because it was at this moment, and one of the comments that Trevor Sr. makes, that first Holmes reports, this is the first time I ever thought maybe I could this could be a profession for me. Isn't that interesting? But it's another one of these things where it's produced on the arm of Trevor Sr., this J.A., for Holmes to observe, and it seems as if you were once intimately associated with someone with the initials J.A., whom you now wish to forget, or something like that. And that's what freaks Trevor out. And then it turns out, of course, that Trevor's real name is James Armitage. Now, that gets us to the question unasked by Watson, which should have been, well, Holmes, why on earth would someone tattoo of all possible things their own initials? I mean, unless you are terribly absent-minded, you're not about to forget what your initials are. What's the point of that, I wonder? But, of course, as trusting readers, we don't.
Simple, Watson. Literary license.
Well, speaking of literary license, there's another great case where tattoos appear, and that is in the Red-Headed League, which is a wonderful, and it's the same sort of purpose in which the presence of a tattoo allows Sherlock Holmes to present some deductions and inferences and conclusions about where Jabez Wilson has been, which astonish Watson. But the lovely thing is how completely off base Watson is. The first thing we hear from Watson is, well, here's this fellow. He bears every mark of being an average, commonplace British tradesman, obese, pompous, and slow. There was nothing remarkable about the man except his blazing red hair. Well, ha-ha. And, in fact, Holmes points out, among other things, well, you've got this tattoo, which I see, which could only come from China because that coloration is very peculiar and specific to China. And by the way, you're a Freemason. And by the way, you have a Chinese coin hanging, and that gives one of the great character comments that recur occasionally in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, in which the astonished Jabez Wilson, to have this description parroted back to him, is floored. How could you possibly know? And then once Holmes explains, he says, oh, well, for a moment, I thought you'd done something clever. but now I see it's, why I could have tattooed "been to China" across my forehead. Yeah, perfectly obvious.
Yeah, and I love how it's pieced together by Holmes observing that he did manual labor at some time, and also saying that he had made a trip to China. It wouldn't have been too much of a stretch for Holmes to say that he had actually been a manual laborer on a ship. Wilson himself gives that away when he said, how did you know, for example, that I did manual labor? It's true as gospel, for I began as a ship's carpenter. It wouldn't have been too much of a stretch for Holmes. But Holmes, of course, says that the fish that you have tattooed immediately above your right wrist could only have been done in China. I've made a small study of tattoo marks and even contributed to the literature of the subject. That trick of staining the fish's scales of a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When, in addition, I see a Chinese coin hanging from your watch chain, the matter becomes even more simple. So that really brings it all together.
Now, that is interesting, though, because the word there is above your right wrist. And if it was really above your right wrist, Wilson's shirt and jacket collar would need to be quite short or quite pushed back on his arm, rather than below your right wrist, which would have put it on the back of the palm of your hand. Right.
That's a good point. Well, maybe as he was gesticulating, and, I know cuffs back then weren't necessarily fitted the same way they are today. We could have seen that, the extension of the wrist beyond the sleeves. But
you see, this lays us open to a wonderful opportunity to do a paper about the laundry markings and habits of Jabez Wilson. Where did he get his cuffs? Who cleaned his shoes? Who laundered his shirts? How frequently did that happen? What other tattoos did he have?
Sounds like something that's just a little more than a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
The fish, tattooed immediately above his right wrist. I have made a small study of tattoo marks, Mr. Wilson, and have even contributed to the literature of the subject. That trick of staining the fish scales a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When, in addition, I see a Chinese coin hanging from his watch chain, the matter becomes even more simple.